This topic is a very personally interesting topic to me. As mentioned before, I was a consultant for about 25 years, primarily doing cybersecurity. And I've been teaching at Johns Hopkins University. They always say have a plan B, right? So when I wanted to retire from consulting, my plan B was academia, was being a professor full-time, and I enjoyed it immensely. In Korea, in Asia, and in Europe, this word Industry 4.0 certainly has popped up recently. Not quite as known in the US, but is particularly of interest to our students, our research agenda for the things that we look towards in the scaling of the industrial internet. And so that's what I wanted to talk about today, marrying that cybersecurity background that I have and a lot around identity management to this new world of millions and trillions of things. And so what do we do with the identity when we now bump into this? And so that's what I want to talk about today, scaling for the industrial internet. Industry 4.0, as I mentioned before, let's see if I can get this moving forward. There we go. For those that don't know, and I do this very briefly, but for some this is a little bit new, Industry 4.0 is all about this transition, this revolution from the Industrial Revolution, which we're kind of familiar with, towards the Industrial Revolution 2.0, where we had electricity and we could create labor and mass production, the automobiles, and so there's these dramatic changes over time. Into this Industrial 3.0 where IT came into play. And some would say we spent the past 25, 30 years automating things, and now we have all the data, and now what do we do with it? That's a very simple explanation, very simple question. But then in the past few years, now we have this new term, Industry 4.0, which IoT and cloud and technology, automating complex tasks. The best way I've heard it described is it's this collision, this meeting of the cyber and the physical worlds. And I think that's a good way to describe it. So now we have this degree of complexity, we have IoT and cloud and technology now coming to the forefront. And so what do we do with that in terms of identity management? Just to frame, because in there is a very simplified term, we have technology in there. Technology means so many things. But in the realm of Industry 4.0, it means kind of all of this, and that's towards in the inner circle there. VR, AR, automated reality and virtual reality, security, 5G, which is huge now in Korea. They see that as really going to accelerate the next wave of innovation, particularly in Korea and Asia. Networks, cloud, big data, blockchain, GPS, you can see all of that, robotics, IoT, and AI, all driving those things on the outside. And it's really interesting then to see what's happening. I'll give you sort of some examples of what's happening in Korea, but even in China, for example. Smart factories, this year Samsung is converting 100 of its factories in Korea to smart factories. And so, this acceleration, not in spans of 5 years, 3 years, but in 1 year, is now we're seeing this right here in Singapore, fintech, huge, really accelerating. Smart government, which is big in Korea, and you can kind of see the rest. All these being underpinned and driven by some basics, certainly identity being one of those. I'm a big guy on design. I heard a lot about that yesterday with UI and UX and things like that. I thought this is a great quote by Herbert Simon, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in '78. But it's all about saying that everyone who devises a course of action is changing existing situations into preferred ones. Some would say, unless you're Mother Nature, you're designing something. So when we think about design and how do we actually changing the existing situations into preferred ones, that says we're not just at the whim of technology and where it goes, we can and will control that. Particularly now when we have this new space in Industry 4.0 and identity. So I wanted to cover really 10 quick areas, 10 areas of interest to us, as I mentioned before, in our research agenda, 10 areas will hopefully be interesting to you as you think about your products, your services, the things that you do. And I'm sure there's a wide variety of that in here. Swarms. The first one of these is all about this notion that it's not just individual things anymore. That now we have this ability for differing devices, differing technologies, all these, anything from cars to drones to the devices themselves, being able now to self-describe, self-collaborate, and self-organize into massive groups that can then tackle tasks in different ways than we had before. Coming together and then separating and introducing and collaborating on new tasks. The idea of swarms then starts to begin to challenge us when we begin to think about identity management. Identity management, not that it's a fault of any of our thinking, but it's maybe a byproduct. We tend to think about it singularly. Identity management for a thing, or maybe several things. But when we get into swarms, we're talking about massive sets of identities coming together for usually short periods of time, solving things, being delegated tasks on our behalf, and then executing those and going away. When we think about identity, then, identity says, who are they? Who are they doing things on behalf of? Who's responsible for the outcomes of those? Those are all really interesting questions that typically we've only sort of said it belongs to a human being, an individual. We have to think differently now about how do we manage identity in a rapidly self-organizing construct like swarms, and this is one that we're looking at. Second to these areas, for us anyway, is this idea of APIs as the new middleman. I know of several financial organizations, in particularly New York, very notable ones, that are now delegating what has been traditionally knowledge of human beings, very smart human beings, to APIs. The APIs then become that new middleman to do things that we typically only expected human beings to do, like risk. One of those financial services firms I mentioned in New York has traditionally, when you call somebody on the phone, they then give you some advice, and they're taking their knowledge of the institution, their knowledge of the financial products, and being able to give you sound advice based upon the regulations and the rules they're under, and knowing the risk, your risk tolerance in doing that. That's a very human being type of scenario. Instead, this firm is taking that knowledge and the risk knowledge of the market at very extreme velocities and putting those into an API and having that then fed on a near real-time basis to different software products, to human beings through a UX, UI interface. But now our interface, our expectation of the identity of who we're interfacing with has changed. It's not the human being on the other side anymore. The interface now is the API. So again, it challenges our notion that we're not just dealing with a human being anymore. I don't think we've figured out the construct anymore either of, okay, if that's sound advice, bad advice, we've seen algorithms go bad on Wall Street. We've seen the circuit breakers kick in if the markets get sideways. But we have to start thinking about things around this, the risk, right? If this is automated risk and automated advice, what role does this API have in the responsibility that it's giving to you? The third of these areas that we're looking at is AI as the new UI. So again, we've talked a lot about UI, the user interface, how important it is, right? And designers would know this, that if the product doesn't work, it doesn't work in terms of user interface in most cases. Now many are saying that the artificial intelligence, the way it's wired and the way that intelligence is automated and presented to the user. This is why we talk a lot about bots, for example. The bots need to almost feel like a human being when they're interfacing with somebody. It has to be almost transparent. We're getting so good at this. In my field, in academia, there was an experiment done in one of the major universities in the Midwest in the United States. Students were interacting with a bot with AI behind it. 96% of the students did not know they were not interfacing with a human being. They thought they were interfacing with a professor, which means I'm out of a job very quickly. I'll have to go to career number 3 here very shortly. But this also says, too, for our identity management challenges, how do we construct identity management, not just in terms of permissions, not in terms of claimed identities, but in terms of personalities? How do we construct these in terms of being able to sufficiently put the intelligence and the identity management around this where a human being can interface with that seamlessly and have frictionless, whatever that is, transactions, conversations, advice giving, etc. So AI as the new UI. The fourth area that then impacts us as we think about identity management is informatics. And I've heard it described as the new Latin. The Germanics, Latin, those basic languages that have underpinned all the other languages that have sprouted afterwards. Now we have this new lingua franca, this new language that underpins business, which is informatics. The information and the data is essentially the language of business. It is the way we will communicate. And so now, as we've seen before with artificial intelligence, the way we're going to describe that, user interfaces, the notion that informatics then becomes a central role in the description and the success of identity management takes on a whole different field. That now, even then, we have to maybe even start having self-describing data, which then takes on another role, another notion of identity management. Sandy Pentland, who's a professor up at MIT, has a really great bunch of projects around informatics, privacy being one of those. And whether or not it succeeds, we'll have to see, but it's important, I think, a launching point into being able to start seeing, can data self-describe itself? You know, we all are pretty good at our profession, and we know about privacy and how important that is. We know that as human beings, you know, we're okay with offering identities in certain contexts, in certain situations. But ask us 30 seconds later, maybe by a different person, and that permission changes. Here, you can have my identity because I want to buy a car. Don't you ask me what my identity is. I don't want to give it to you. Why did that change all of a sudden? Right? So this whole notion that informatics and particularly data can possibly self-describe itself. That informatics and data can possibly have its own identity. It has a really interesting context and construct for an Industry 4.0. There may be no other possible way for us to have data flying around the internet and being consumed and used by things in a permissive way, unless we have it being able to self-describe and have those permissions contained within itself. That's a really far-fetched kind of construct about identity that we're taking away from human beings and put it into data, and it can describe itself. Sandy Pentland, I think, is one that's being able to look at that, and I think it's a really interesting project. The fifth area then we look at related to identity management and Industry 4.0. We know B2B, we've heard that quite a bit, business to business, B2C, business to consumer. We're now getting into H to H, human to humans, personal area networks. And being able to, now we can see this, being able to be next to each other, to have things connect to each other, even have networks around us in our bodies with pills, with sensors built into clothes, that now the personal area networks around us and the things that we wear can also take on a life of its own, the identity as well. When we have medicine now, we have pills that we can swallow that can actually monitor lots of things, glucose levels, the health of our bodies, etc. Those aren't just dumb devices anymore. When we have, in a different way, if we have personal area networks with our clothes, all of these things then, as I mentioned, do things on our behalf. We're delegating things to them. And again, they have identities then associated with us that we then delegate our identities to them. What we don't know is, for these personal area networks, how do we need to have sort of sub-identities of ourselves that then we give to these personal area networks, so they are descriptive about our medical health, about our psychological health, about our feelings, how we're thinking about something, our emotions. MIT again is doing some really interesting work about emotions, and so all these sort of delegations aren't without this identity component. All these things that we delegate would actually mean nothing if it wasn't associated with something, somebody. And so personal area networks really stretch that for us as we get into industries and we're walking around and we're fixing things and we're interfacing with things, and also that those parts and systems are doing it on our behalf. Now personal area networks take over. The next of these is voice as the new platform. I would be probably the biggest skeptic when it comes to new technology. I shouldn't be by now. I'm old enough, I'm wiser. But when they come out, I see them going, what in the world could that be useful for? Really, seriously. When I saw the Alexas and stuff, I'm going, yeah, really, is somebody going to walk around their house and say, hey, I want some more dog food? And I'm really interested by how far this is taking off. And when I sit back then and start watching things take over, and I watch how ambient it is, and how that it's actually taking, again, delegating things out of our lives that we would normally, we'd normally have to say, be explicit about. Do this for me. Well, it's kind of knowing that already. Voice then, and I've seen this in China quite a bit too, I didn't realize how people viewed that as so frictionless that they wanted to use that instead of typing. I guess it makes sense, right? That now just being able to speak in my smartphone, speak in my house, speak in my car, speak in public places, my voice then becomes my identity. My voice then does things on my behalf. My voice actions things. And so voice as the new platform then will sort of say, okay, wait a second, identity now takes on another realm, right? The voice now as a platform can do so many different things. When I talk to my students, I also start really hitting upon, this is where we start seeing worlds collide. That it's not just voice, it's not a command. Right? It's voice at a certain point in time with a certain intonation actually evoking something, right? So if I say yeah, those are three different things of the same voice actually invoking three different actions potentially on my behalf. As a cold, I might even say it differently, but the voice then now gives us a whole different identity to how we interface with machines, and the machines will have to understand that. Yeah. And there's many more examples of this, and the Industry 4.0 will start to pick this up. Seventh area that we're looking at is this area, this notion of how hyper-local things are. Great examples that H example. I mean, it's very local to me, but we're also seeing this in the Industry 4.0 age, where things that will happen in Germany at a particular factory at a point in the supply chain line matter to the output of that potentially in China or the US? You know, what's happening on a BMW line about that car impacts something down the line, potentially in sales. Potentially, if you go all the way through where this then gets picked up in the supply chain to an analyst in Wall Street, who actually does want to know, are these parts really truly effective? Are they coming out at the right speed? Are there new parts? There's so many questions around that. There's so many questions that people want to know. And usually it's been after the fact that we do things. We have whole vocabularies invented for that. Channel checks, quality assurance, all these after the fact things that now get built into this notion that hyperlocal information can become useful around the globe, that flat world. So hyperlocal then, an aggregate of these different technologies in particular locations at points in time around particular products become useful as we describe the identities of the things that are around them, either people or products or services. And so the hyperlocalness now, we do want to know, we will want to know. When something was happening in Germany on that supply chain, what was happening around it? What vehicle was it associated with? What robot was doing it at the time? Was there a supervisor there? You know, and what is it emitting? So now we have a whole different, different continuum of identity that gets associated with that. The eighth of these is what we call just-in-time innovation. It used to be very much planned innovation. And we'll still have much of this, but now because we're in Industry 4.0, we have all the devices. We have all of these smart devices that can actually do things on our behalf. And this is happening now. We have self-describing machinery that we don't have to send somebody out there anymore to see if it's breaking. It will tell us, I'm going to break. These are the conditions that usually cause me to break, or I can see it now and it's telling things out. And the just-in-time then innovation could say, okay, now evoke this process. This identity that is telling us this thing, this is a trusted identity, it's doing something on behalf of a human being potentially that we've delegated to it. And now because of that, start making some things happen. Bring in the parts, replace the parts, ground the aircraft, whatever those are. The innovation cycle then starts to change much more towards the actual event and early on, as opposed to afterwards, what can we do to change something? We also, we've seen this too with, particularly in Industry 4.0, where because we're delegating to these different devices, the ability to say you can morph, you can change, you can, I mentioned before those swarms, you can collaborate without having to have a human being there. So now we can have innovation actually exist without a human being directing it. And for example, swarms being able to create different products depending on what's needed at the time. Is the just-in-time innovation that we're seeing. This is really happening quite a bit, particularly in automation. Ninth of these is new organizations, that gig economy, which you've heard a lot about, etc. But as we think about swarms of things in IoT, now we can also think about this much more about human beings too, that we can actually, the identities then associated with that change. Because not just a singular person or smaller groups of people actually doing certain tasks, but we have entire new organizations then that come together to activate and execute on certain tasks without a human being oftentimes directing them. And we can think of it a lot of times around political types of things. But now we also see that as people want to create their own products, as people want to collaborate on new ways of invention, Particularly down in China, when we look at hardware innovation, down in Shenzhen, we see a lot of this kind of new organizations, people kind of popping in, popping out, creating something, validating it and exporting it quickly, even if they're not actually in Shenzhen, China, right? So we have this idea then that identities don't have to be, again, with just a person. We don't even have to have identities with known entities and organizations. We can have self-describing, almost pop-up organizations occurring quite frequently around the globe, executing on tasks. And it really challenges the notion of identities, not just really associated with the human beings, but associated with the organizations. Can it go together? Can it come together, invent something, get it out to the market, and then go away and deconstruct, and another one pop up tomorrow? How do we manage those sort of transient identities associated with organizations? And lastly is the 4 Ps. We've heard this a lot with marketing, price, and position, and those sorts of things. But this is much more related to the data, right? I used to hear it a lot when I was working with the innovation centers that I ran around data and data velocity and things. But we would look at it from what can be actionable. From moving from reactive to proactive to predictive to prescriptive to preemptive. And those 4 Ps then start to describe, okay, identities taking on really new tasks on our behalf that might challenge how we've seen identities before. To have an identity actually be prescriptive. To swallow a pill and actually say, you need some insulin, and by the way, you should not be waiting to go to the hospital tomorrow to get it. Where can a pill and identity then actually be prescriptive and start preempting things on your behalf? Right? Who's delegating that? Whose identity is that? And same thing with aircraft parts, grounding airplanes, stopping supply chains because things are happening. So identities, hopefully what I've been able to do is have a little bit of a journey through what we're thinking about in the Industry 4.0 space, and hopefully challenging our notion that it's not just a human being anymore, it's just not just a singular thing anymore, but there's a lot of different concepts that are going to challenge how do we view identity as we go forward. So hopefully that was useful. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
What were the 4 Ps again?
Going from reactive, that's a proactive, preemptive, prescriptive, predictive.
Thanks.
So I have a little bit of a cold.
Any other questions?
I'm very interested about this personal level, like the smart glasses, smart watch.
Right.
So what kind of technologies behind are being used for this personal level?
What ontologies did you say?
Technologies.
Technologies.
Sorry.
Yeah, there's lots of sensors now. I've seen for example, particularly with smart clothes, that now we can embed the sensors. A lot of the athlete performance has been around analyzing the sweat, for example. How much salt is in the sweat, how much is being sweated at one particular time from different parts of the body, etc. So there's just a kind of a simple saline type of sensor.
Sorry, I'm talking about the network.
Oh, the network
Does it
itself.
work with Bluetooth or?
Yeah, well, Bluetooth right now is the simplest way that's coming into play with the smartphones. I would say that over time, though, that we'll see something else pop up, and I'm not smart enough to know what that is right now. I think we're going to see it in 2 ways. One is both the communication locally through Bluetooth, but also are there faster ways of getting the information through, wireless or those sorts of things.
I was also quite fascinated by this H2H idea that But this is mainly concentrated on the self, on myself, or is it also related to communicating with your next person? So some kind of loosely coupled systems, meeting each other and then parting again? Is this also part of this H2H concept?
Yeah, it's really both. You know, H to H, the human-to-human interface, you know, it's really, when we're thinking about this now, for DuPont, 3M actually did this recently. They were actually curious about who has innovation in the entire 3M organization. They knew that you as a scientist were particularly innovative, but why are you as a scientist not particularly innovative? And what they found is you would interact with more people than you would. And so this H to H, instead of always handing out business cards, we can start to see that there's a length of time that we're talking at a certain place, and why aren't you involved? And can we start then having people aggregate in different places more to share that information? They call it the water cooler moment, where we, you know, going back here, hi, how are you doing? What have you been working on? That sort of stuff. So the H to H can go off like that too.
Thank you.
We're good. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.